So we'll just get started in a few seconds. All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the first panel session of Black in Neuro Week. I'm Rakib Tesfaye. I'm a co-founder of Black in Neuro, and I'm a PhD candidate in neuroscience at the University of McGill. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I am located on an unceded Indigenous lands. The Kanien'kehá:ka Nation is recognized as the custodians of the land and waters of which I gather from today. Tiohtià:ke, known to many of you as Montreal, is historically a gathering place for many First Nations communities. And so I want to also remind folks that we have live captioning, and we also have, and actually our wonderful moderator Ashley has put that into the chat for you. And we also have a sign language interpreter for those who can benefit from that. Before we start, I want to also thank our generous conference sponsors, without which these events would not be possible. So thank you so much to everyone who has supported us. Now, today is Black in Neuro Research Day, and it's all about highlighting the research and people behind the people behind the research in the Black in Neuro community. Throughout the day, we will be asking members in the Black in Neuro community to share graphical abstracts or recent publications, share graphical abstracts of their work, of course, and recent publications on social media using the hashtag Black in Neuro Research Day and hashtag Cite Black in Neuro. Later on, we will have a keynote talk at 3 p.m. Eastern by Dr. Sosina Wood, who is an incoming professor at Carnegie Mellon. A reminder that if you are unable to attend this talk or any of the sessions throughout the week, that you can check out our YouTube page where all of our events will be available, and they'll be posted very shortly after each session. So right now, we are going to be talking about the landscape of African neuroscience. Much of the origins of neuroscience can be traced back to the African continent over 5,000 years ago. The continent is home to the most genetic diversity in the world. It's very important for understanding human diseases, neurological disorders. And so today our discussion will center around an article published in Nature Communications that analyzed 2 decades worth of publications that were based on in the African continent. And we're very lucky to have 3 of the authors from this article today. So if you want to share any highlights from our discussion, you can use the hashtag Black in Neuro Week 2021 or BIN W21 and hashtag Black in Neuro Research Day. If you want to ask questions throughout the discussion today, you can just post them in the chat and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. So we are very fortunate to have with us 3 incredible panelists, Dr. Ibukun and Kinrinade, Dr. Mohamed Bukbar Meina, and Dr. Abdelrahman Abushuk. And so I'm going to ask our lovely panelists to introduce themselves to our audience. So Mahmoud, I'm going to start with you.
Hello, thanks very much for having us. It's really amazing to be part of this community. I'm a research fellow at the University of Sussex in the UK, and also a visiting scientist in US State University in Nigeria. And my area of research is on Alzheimer's disease. I work on the popular 2 proteins, tau protein and amyloid beta. But I'm currently in Nigeria, as you can guess, based on my address. I'm currently in Nigeria on a collaborative project to produce iPSC neurons from African resident population. As you know, the genetic diversity in Africa is super important, but at the moment, I think in the field, we don't really have iPSC models from the African resident population. So I got a funding to go and do that. Thank you.
Yes, that is amazing. Thank you so much. And I think the statistic is somewhere around 80% of genetic studies include European participants, right? So that's incredible work. Thank you so much. Ibukun, we'll go next to you.
Hi, I'm Ibukun. I'm a postdoc at University of Calgary at the Baines Lab. And I'm currently looking at the role of stress systems and sociality. We look at social interaction and the effect of stress, how stress affects interaction between mice. Thank you.
Nice to have another Canadian-based person on the chat today. And Abdelrahman, we'll go to you.
Hello, everybody. I'm Abdelrahman. I graduated from the Faculty of Medicine at Shams University in 2015. Then I came to the US. I did research at Harvard, and I'm currently at Cleveland Clinic. My field of interest is mainly stroke as a complication of cardiovascular disease and cardiovascular interventions. So my field of interest mainly lies within cardiology, and that's quite odd, but I'm interested in neurology and its link to cardiology. And that's quite odd because cardiologists and neurologists don't often love each other, but I found myself in this place and I love it. Thank you for inviting me today.
Well, thank you for bridging them together. All right, so I want to start, before we delve into the article, which I've posted in the chat, and if you haven't read it, I would highly, highly recommend that you do so. But I want to get to know our panelists a little bit more. So would you mind telling us how you got or developed an interest in neuroscience and what the path you took or your journey to pursuing those neuroscience interests? Ibukun, we'll start with you.
Well, yeah, my path into neuroscience was a bit of serendipity. So for my master's, I also looked at, I studied anti-malarial drugs, and basically under the umbrella of drug misuse and abuse. And as you know, there's a lot of misuse of drugs in general in Africa. So taking Nigeria into account, I decided to look at the use of anti-malarial drugs, but then I studied like the heart and the arteries. And then there was this, some of my colleagues were studying the brain. I was like, what's so cool about the brain? And I started to get involved with their project. And that was when I started to develop this interest that, wow, okay, there's a lot of things to look at, not just in the heart, but also in the brain. And fortunately, I got some funding to go for some conferences where I learned more about the brain. And that was how the path into neuroscience got paved for me. And yeah, it's been an interesting journey so far.
Wonderful, thanks so much. Abdelrahman, do you want to tell us about your journey into neuroscience?
Yes, I was initially interested in neurodegenerative disease like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and similar disease like that. But then I went, I was interested in them like theoretically when I was a student, and I used to take online courses in that to advance my knowledge in that regard. Then I went to the clinic and I got depressed because these patients usually don't evolve because we have no very effective treatment so far, and that's a very big field of neuroscience and clinical neuroscience research, developing treatments for these diseases. So I said, I was about to leave neuroscience because, I wanted to feel like I'm having an impact in the patient's life, but then I decided to do stroke research and perhaps link that to my training in cardiology, because in stroke, you can still see some improvement on the patient when the patient comes and you administer some drugs and the patient can completely recover. So that's how I got interested in stroke, and I have been pursuing that kind of research since.
Okay, great. So both of you kind of getting into the field from initially heart research, and that's awesome. Okay, great. And Mahmoud, last but not least.
Yeah, I guess for me, the real motivation has been when I was growing up, because
Oh no, Mahmoud, I think you're breaking up. All right, well, Gary. Mahmoud, I don't know if you can hear us, but you're breaking up.
You see people that. Oh, can you hear me? That's super weird.
Yeah, sorry.
I can hear you, but can you hear me now?
We can hear you loud and clear now. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm in Nigeria right now, and the network can be very, very bad. So like I was saying, I mean, for me, my real motivation to go into neuroscience has been, growing up, there are a lot of misconceptions about brain diseases, from the community. You see people that have brain diseases being stigmatized. So that was really kind of an interesting observation for me when I went to do my bachelor's degree in human anatomy. We learn about the brain, and then it was through that I came to realize that actually it is due to problems related to the brain. So that has been my real initial motivation. So after that, I went to work part-time in a psychiatric hospital, and that really consolidated my interest. But I guess to go into neuroscience, I realized that we don't have facilities in Nigeria, no role models, no funding. For example, throughout my undergraduate degree, I never saw anything like fluorescence microscope, Western blotting. I did nothing like that. So I realized that I have to really leave Nigeria to be able to pursue this. And I was fortunate to get funding for my master's in Sussex to do my master's, and then following that, the PhD. So really, this has been my journey. And
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I want to follow off of what Mahmoud has just said to Ibukan and we've
been very interesting so far because.
Sorry, Mahmoud, we lost you again.
I'm here.
I'm sorry, I cut you off on the tail end because we just lost you with the connection. Do you mind just saying the last thing that you were just explaining?
Yeah, I was just saying that, but it's kind of interesting now that I'm able to go back to Nigeria to do research and also go back to the UK, linking up these two different continents that have really helped in training me.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to follow up with that. Many of us move from our home regions to study in graduate school and beyond. Certainly for you, Ibukan and Abdelrahman, you are far away from home. Can you maybe expand on what was access like regarding research, not necessarily neuroscience research, but academic research in general? What were some of the barriers that you had encountered with science in your home country?
I did a study on that when I was a student. I did it mainly about students' perception and barriers towards clinical research. It's a part of medical research in general. And we have analyzed 10 barriers that students face, that medical and biomedical students face towards entry into research. And the most significant one in my country, at least, was the most significant barriers were lack of time, lack of funding, and lack of mentors. These were the most significant three that most students have selected as why they wouldn't get into research. And lack of time is quite understandable because a study in biomedical sciences can be heavy and intense, and you have a lot of examinations. And the research culture is still not very prevalent, so that you know how to divide your time between research and study and stuff like that. Lack of mentoring, that was a very significant barrier that we have faced, because not all the faculties that teach in African universities are heavily involved in research. Most of them are involved in teaching or clinical practice. So it would be hard to find like a mentor who's interested in research and then who's interested in teach others research. And also lack of funding. But that has started to improve in recent years, at least in my country of Egypt, because universities have started to provide like small grants for students, like maybe $1,000 or something, which is very small, but you know it's some form of motivation in that regard. So these were the three main barriers towards accessing like high quality research in general in my home country of Egypt, and I believe it would apply to many other countries in Africa.
Yeah, following up on Abdurrahman, speaking from my personal experience, I think the main challenge was the lack of equipment. Like, I remember after my master's trying to develop my PhD, I came up with a draft, let's say a proposal for my project. And I quickly realized, wow, it's going to be difficult to actually do these things because there were no equipment to do most of what I wanted to do. And that was how my sojourn to out of the country started. So I had to go to France for a year to try to develop my thesis. But then unfortunately, my supervisor in Nigeria passed away. The next person retired, and I was left with no one to follow up. So I then had to start my PhD process again. So I had to move to Portugal to start my PhD from the scratch. So that's just an example of the challenges one faces, and one faces that makes one have to move from our country. So yeah, there's lack of equipment, in my case, I did have a mentor. Fortunately, he passed away, but yeah, they are not, I mean, you can actually unpick how many people are really willing, to go into research. It's not because they don't want to do that. Just as Abdurrahman said, there's a huge workload in terms of teaching. They have a high teaching workload that prevents them to then focus on research. It was not until I moved to France that I realized, you can actually be in the academia and focus on research like all your life and not be involved in teaching. I was astounded when I realized that, because that's not the case in my own country. So yeah, it's true what Abdurrahman has just mentioned.
I guess to add one last thing, because they've mentioned everything, is the lack of electricity. I mean, some places do have that. I'm currently in Nigeria. I came for a project that ideally should take me 2 weeks, but where I am, with the electricity is not stable, so we have to use solar panels, inverter to power the lab and everything. And because it's the raining season, so when the sun does not come out, we have a problem. So this is nearly my 2nd month in Nigeria because of just power problem.
Wow. Yeah, thank you for sharing those challenges. And some of these factors that you're bringing up, specifically technology, is something that was captured in your analysis in the article that we're going to talk about. So I want to shift to actually talking about some of the outcomes of that paper. But first, you looked at, I believe it was over 5,000 studies that were performed in Africa since 1996. And I mean, some great news. You found that neuroscience publications are increasing across the continent, but there are a select few countries. And actually, before we get to the outcomes, if you don't mind, can you talk about why you decided to do the paper, and what the objectives were? Before we get into the outcomes, for those who haven't read the paper.
Yeah, sure. So the general idea came around 2015, given all the challenges that we've mentioned, I was thinking, you know what, there are a lot of challenges about doing research in Africa, but do even the researchers within the continent understand the extent of these challenges? And do other people outside the continent also understand those challenges? Because it's only when you understand such challenges that you will be able to address the problems. And without understanding that, African researchers will be disadvantaged in terms of admission to schools, in terms of research funding, etc. So generally, I kind of thought, okay, you know what? There are neuroscience research coming out from Africa and everything like that. But really, how much of that is within Africa? It's only after we know what is coming within African laboratories that we'll be able to know the real problem, the real strengths, and the weaknesses that funders can then be able to use. Because, for example, IBRO, which is also funding this initiative, has invested in African neuroscience for a long, long time. So funders will also be interested in knowing where to focus their funding on. So this has really been one of the major drivers. Obviously, from that, we started thinking about all these different ideas. And one of these major ideas is that, you know what, Africa is quite heterogeneous. Although people will say, are you from Africa and everything, but Africa has West Africa, East Africa, South Africa, and Southern Africa, and even within a region, there's a lot of heterogeneity. So we also wanted to figure out how that heterogeneity defines the scientific output coming out. Because even in terms of collaboration for research, in terms of funding for research, in terms of training, you really need to know this heterogeneity to provide targeted interventions. So this was the initial motivation. But let me just keep quiet here if Ibukun and Abdurrahman want to add something onto this.
So in my case, one of the motivating factors that made me join in this research was so I and Mahmoud, we were actually we participated in a workshop from an organization known as Training Africa, who have the focus of developing scientists, equipping them, with adequate knowledge of science. And from that workshop, we have been discussing, how to tackle these challenges. It's not something you can do like all at once. It has to be gradual. And so we keep saying, oh, we don't have adequate funding. We keep saying we don't have adequate facilities, but what can we hold on to? We are scientists, right? We need to quote something. And that was, for me, that was a good motivation, to be a part of this project. We needed to have something to always refer to. Say if we want to apply for a grant, for instance, we need to quote something, right? We need references. And so that was what spurred this research for me. And true to our initial hypothesis, or the anecdotes, that the general idea of what's in there, we saw truly that, there are publications, but there's also the restriction in terms of the visibility, So, and we also noticed that truly it's really not such a sad story overall. There seems to be like an opening at the end of the tunnel in terms of research. It's gradually increasing, but more work still needs to be done. So,
and thank you so much. And that's what I really enjoyed about the paper is, that it isn't all bad news. And we are seeing increasing research and publications across the continent. And I want to dissect some of those outcomes that you found, to give the audience a better idea of the landscape or the portrait that you painted in the article itself. And so going back to that idea of heterogeneity that Mahmoud brought up, there were a select few countries that you found that were driving publications. And there were specific types of neuroscience fields that really did seem to be prevalent in around the continent. Can you expand on these findings and give us a brief overview of what neuroscience publications looked like over the 20-year span that you analyzed? And that can go to any of you.
Okay, I'll go for the topics, and I think the countries Dr. Mahmoud can address that best. So in terms of the topic, we did find that the most prevalent topics investigated in Africa's research were neurodegeneration and trauma research. And we were quite asked about that. The reviewers asked us about that, because it is an interesting finding. And I believe it's out of need. I'm a member of a global study called the Global Burden of Disease, in which we assess the prevalence of almost 400 major diseases around the world. And in Africa, almost the most common neurological disease and the most uprising, and that will become the major source of disease burden in the continent by 2050 is neurodegenerative disease, like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and other diseases like that. So we did comment on that in the article that our work in the global burden of disease has shown that the country is facing an increasing burden of neurodegenerative disease as well as trauma, because a lot, and that goes back to my brief period of clinical training in neurology. A lot of the cases that you see and the neurological cases in ICUs are usually young people in trauma accidents, like motor vehicle accidents and stuff like that. So Africa is experiencing one of the highest rates of neurodegenerative diseases and trauma in the world. And so the research is logically balancing that up. And so I believe that's a logical explanation for the findings we reported in our study.
So sorry, I just got lost. I'll probably mention a few things. In terms of the prevalence of research in neurodegenerative diseases, one of the major reasons, I guess, is also perhaps due to the fact that, especially in some regions like West Africa, there are a lot of medicinal plants. So researchers naturally have this idea that, these diseases have no treatment. With these medicinal plants, there's a potential that we could find something. So that is one. And secondly, there is also this idea that funding on something that is more disease is more likely to be successful than funding on something that is just about understanding how our brain works. This is especially very important in Africa. For example, in Nigeria at the moment, the major funder is TED Fund, Tertiary Education Trust Fund. And one of the funding ideas that is coming up now is that they are only interested in funding translational research. So you see, there is that idea. Therefore, you have to think about the real cases, patients, when you are making application. So I'm going to keep quiet here because I lost you during the question. I don't know what you asked.
No, thank you so much, and that makes sense. Focusing on the applications for problems on the continent, but also on the flip side, that means that there's less capacity for basic research and exploration as well. I don't know if you heard this, Mahmoud, before you cut off, but I also wanted to point out your comment about heterogeneity earlier on. In the paper, you find that there are very few countries in the African continent that are actually driving research and publications. Can you talk a little bit about that finding?
Sure. I think what we found was that there are three major countries driving publications in Africa: Egypt, South Africa, and Nigeria. And in terms of what is driving that, for South Africa, I think it is the local funding, obviously coupled with the international funding. For Egypt, to some extent, Abdurrahman is from
Sorry, Mahmoud, we're losing you again.
But for Egypt as well, I think funding also. Can you hear me now, or am I still?
Yeah. So you cut off. You cut off from Egypt. So you were explaining some of those factors.
Okay, you know what? This is even a perfect example of some of the challenges that researchers go through in Africa. Yeah,
absolutely about to say that as well. This is we're not simulating this for this panel. This is what is this existing reality. But thank you so much for sticking with it.
Sure. Can you hear me now? Well, yeah.
Yes, we can.
All right. So I said Egypt, South Africa, and Nigeria are the major drivers. And in terms of Egypt and South Africa, it is partly linked to the funding. So, for example, both Egypt and South Africa invest about 0.7% of their GDP in research. But for Nigeria, it's not really the funding, because Nigeria invests only about 0.2% of its GDP in funding. So for Nigeria, it is the number of neuroscientists in the country that are driving research. And also because there is this idea, publish or perish. And in the country, the policy is that to get promoted, you have to publish. So a lot of young scientists, especially in the area of biosciences, are going into neurosciences. So because of that number, there is a proportionate increase in the number of publications. And obviously Nigeria has about 20 million population. But in terms of the other regions, Morocco is doing great, Algeria is doing great. They have some good infrastructure, but they do not have a large number of neuroscientists.
And, going back, Ibukun, to what you said earlier on, you are also finding that there are gaps within the technologies being used, and that they're concentrated on what you refer to as type 1 techniques. Do you mind expanding on that a little bit, that gap between kind of more complex or even genetically modifiable low resource models like zebrafish aren't widely used? Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Absolutely. So we have, that's also an underlying, challenge faced in Africa. So we kind of grouped this in terms of techniques into type 1 and type 2. Based on, when we looked at the kind of the outputs and the kind of techniques being used. Basically what that means when we talk about type 1 and type 2 is that one is quite, accessible. It doesn't really require, it's not so, difficult the techniques are not so difficult to use in the terrain that's in the African terrain. When you consider factors like electricity, when you consider factors like, the technical know-how of how to use these things, they are quite, easy to use. But then, so what we realize is that many of the papers that are being published use these techniques, use these simpler techniques, because we lack the accessibility to these other we like the intricate I can use the word intricate techniques. And it's a way of adapting to the environment. We know we have the drive to do research. We have the drive to perform, to try to answer our local questions. But we also know that we don't have the availability of this high-tech equipment. So we have to adapt to what is available. And that's why we see this trend in the papers, right? That's why not many, I think it's only South Africa and one other country that I can't remember now, that we noticed use like genetically modified organisms and used other high-end techniques like, say, electrophysiology. I'm not sure if we documented electrophysiology, or like fluorescence microscopy, and you know, all other intricate, more technical equipments. So yeah, it boils down to the fact that we really don't have access to this facilities, so we just have to adapt to what is, you know, available to try to answer our questions.
I can add something to that. It's like a little bit,
quickly, just
okay.
Oh, sorry, Abdul Rahman, do you want to go, and then we'll get to you, Mahmoud?
Okay, it's a little bit of personal experience for me. When I, you know, I was a medical student, and there was a study working on, and we wanted to do some electron microscopy for some of the tissues we got. So I went to the principal of research affairs at my university, and I told him that I need to use, you know, an electron microscopy to get certain images. He told me, great, we have 3 electron microscopes in our university, one's this department, one's department, and one's department. So I told them, so which one can I use? He said, none. 2 of them are broken, and the third one, the technician is not here. He is on vacation. So that shows you first that sometimes there is lack of flexibility, and sometimes when the machines are there, because the maintenance sometimes is too expensive, so they don't get maintained well, and also the lack of trained personnel. So if you got like a multi-million-dollar device like an electron microscopy, and there's only one person who can use it, and everyone else is dependent on the person. So you need not only the existence of these devices, but also a lot of trained personnel to be able to operate them as the needs of university allow.
Brilliant, Abdurrahman. I mean, this is exactly what I wanted to address. But I guess for the real motivation, if you look at it, we really wanted to profile what is available to be able to show the world, this is what we have. So if you really want to help out, you want to do something, this is a fantastic area to help out. For example, in the whole of Nigeria, to the best of my knowledge, we don't have any microscope. Honestly, when I got donated a confocal microscope to a lab that I'm setting up in Nigeria, I mean, this is really, really, not great. I mean, when I was doing my undergraduate degree, we have an electrons microscope that stopped working in the 1980s. So this is what we are talking about.
Mahmoud, you've muted yourself.
Did you? So you didn't get?
No, we heard most of it. We just heard the microscopes that were still around from the 80s, which is not convenient for today's research.
Yeah. So that's where I stopped. I mean, I'm just trying to emphasize the point that some of the equipment either are there, but they've stopped working. And like Abdurrahman said, some of them, there is no trained personnel to use it. But to large extent, we don't have them.
Yeah. And it's also very interesting, you know, a lot of the animal models are really mice models, as you had mentioned, that are being used on the continent. And there's really this lack of use of fruit flies and zebrafish. And so that, you know, ties in nicely to what you were saying about that capacity for building basic research as well on the continent. And I'm sure a lot of the technologies are going to... Oh, sorry. I was just going to say,
one thing...
we'll probably get back to... Go ahead.
Oh, sure. Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, I'm noticing the time, and I want to get to some of the other meatier outcomes of the paper. And I'm sure that when we talk about funding, that'll tie into technology very nicely at the end as well. Another outcome that you looked at was publication metrics. So can you give us an understanding of, you know, how did these different publication metrics that you looked at, mainly citation and impact factor, in the African continent compared to articles being published elsewhere around the world? And if you don't mind, can you emphasize the distinction between impact factor and citations that you write about in your article?
All right, sure. If I get lost again, one of them I'm sure would address that. So in nutshell, we understand that citation and impact factor are not good metrics for visibility, but we still needed something to help us say much about that. So we kind of looked at the impact factor for all the 12,000 articles, 5,000 something articles that we analyzed. And we also looked at the Google Scholar citation for those articles. After doing that, we compared that to 200 articles collected from UK, United States, Australia, Brazil, and Japan, which we decided to call Global Not, excluding Brazil. What we found was that none of these African countries, especially regions, can be compared to the Global North, obviously. But South Africa, to some extent, is doing good because they are on par with Brazil. So it's more like each of those different African regions are on their own developmental milestone, with West Africa far, far behind, and the other regions kind of doing a little bit good. But we went deeper to try to look at, for example, Nigeria. For that, we published the first article, which critically looked at these publication citations and everything. And one of the key things that we discovered, and I'm going to allow you probably to probe for that if you're interested, but what we discovered was that most of the papers end up being published in African, some of the papers end up being published in African journals, but those papers don't get cited as much as those that were published outside Africa. And we also realized that when you have good collaboration, especially with international partners, you end up getting more citation. So that's a bit problematic, but I'm going to stop there.
And I just want, talking about that idea, you use Nigeria as a case study in, not a case study, but one example in the article itself about a country that is publishing quite a lot, but mainly in African journals and not getting that visibility on the global stage. And so I'm wondering, of the research being conducted right now, of the articles being written up right now, what do you think needs to happen in order to increase that visibility? And I'm also interested to know, because you mentioned that being indexed in somewhere like PubMed is one solution, but how do you think pushing back on traditional academia, like for instance using open access, open science, could help with this challenge?
So yeah, so I can take that. So I think, well, using Nigeria as a case study, if I'm wrong, Mahmoud, correct me. So what I know about publication in academia in Nigeria is that, yes, it's a requirement for promotion, but the requirements, except now maybe it's changing now, the trend has always been publish in a journal. And oftentimes they're encouraged to publish in local journals to promote these local journals. Unfortunately, these local journals don't have as much reach as the international journals. One of the reasons is because, yeah, they are not indexed in PubMed. So then the reach is limited. And the other thing I noticed is that if you publish in these journals, not all of them have these ratings in terms of citation index and impact factor. So also that limits, which is what is used, currently as in terms of increasing the reach. It's still not, we are still not there in terms of those local journals. The other thing I noticed is that since researchers are not pressured to publish in like international journals, then they publish in this local journals, and that limits the reach. In fact, some of those journals you cannot even access them over the internet. They are still like hard copies. So this is using Nigeria as a context, and Mahmoud, you can correct me, but that's the information I I have, but maybe now it's outdated. Maybe things, I'm sure things are getting better, but as far as as far as I know, that has been, the situation. So there needs to be, in terms of policy, some changes. There needs to be that either we work on increasing the reach of our local journals, or also we encourage our researchers to publish, in international journals where they can have more visibility. So now talking about international journals, there are some journals that you need to pay a lot of money to publish in. And that is an underlying factor. Since the researchers don't have funding, how can we, publish in this journal? So that is, a great limitation. And yes, you mentioned open access, but even open access is it's not all open access that is free. You still need to pay. It comes at a cost. So those are the kind of challenges that, we are being faced as, African researchers.
Okay, as a quick commentary on that, I think we can summarize this as there needs to be something to increase the visibility of African research. There needs to be something done on the individual level, researchers, and some stuff done on the institutional level. So in terms of individual levels, the barrier is mainly that for many researchers inside Africa, the culture of publishing internationally doesn't even exist. So this culture needs to be enhanced, and we need more workshops and training and how to prepare manuscripts for international publishing and how to approach international journals and stuff like that. Second thing is the language barrier. One striking aspect that you would see is that if you go to read in an African or local journal, is that the article usually flooded with language mistakes. And so people instead, because they can't afford proofreading and stuff like that, they prefer to go into a local journal. So also maybe, providing proofreading services and, enhancing language courses and stuff like that. At institutional level, institutions can put forward a lot of policies that first, obligate promotions to be dictated by international publications too. But not only that, because you are putting researchers, then again, it's a hard role. It's also providing them the resources and training and, knowledge to be able to publish in these journals and achieve the university target. So that's how I see it. There needs to be changes on both levels, individual and university side.
And those are very feasible targets that can be done in a short period of time. Obviously the English language is the current dominant language of science now, but providing translation services so that there's both local impact and global impact is something feasibly that we can push for as a community. So thank you for synthesizing that. We are running out of time, but I do have one big kind of picture last question for you before we move on to the Q&A. And so one of the most salient takeaways from the article is the lack of focus on domestic investment and partnerships. So we see this in many ways in your article. So for instance, most research is internationally funded, mainly from US and Europe, rather than domestically, with the exception of South Africa. Mahmoud, as you indicated earlier on, we see that co-authorships with international researchers is more common than co-authorships with other African researchers. And of course, there are incentives to this. So you show that publications are more likely to have a higher impact or be in a higher impact journal if there's an international collaborator on that paper. So very briefly, can you walk us through the significance of these findings and what it means in the context of ownership and agency of research production in the African continent?
So briefly, it's good from the angle of increasing the scientific output coming from Africa, because with more collaboration, that means more papers and more visibility. But it does not look good from the angle of ownership, because it means that in fact, we've seen papers where researchers go into the African continent, collect data, collect samples, publish that, and never put African authors on the paper. Those are those around the 1996 to 2000. So that's really bad. And even as I speak to you right now, like I said, I'm working on this project which is to produce the iPSC cells from Nigeria, but because of the lack of availability of either the expertise or the facility, I would have to take that to the UK to continue the project. So you see, ownership becomes problematic. So what we really need is an open collaboration where the African researchers are given the lead, and where the funding applied for, there is a provision to allow those researchers to establish existing system within the continent to manage those samples or whatever that they've produced, instead of taking it outside Africa.
Would any of you two like to add on to that? Or has Mahmoud sufficiently synthesized? Okay, thank you so much. And so we're going to move on to some of the Q&A here. Nikki writes, I always struggle with networking. So I was wondering, when it comes to meeting and collaborating with other researchers in your field, are there any challenges that you've experienced? And if so, how did you overcome these? I guess
well, so I'm speaking from experience. So the first conference I went to was in Morocco, and there I met so many I saw so many international researchers, but it was so difficult to communicate with them. First, because I didn't have enough experience as to what to talk about, like in terms of their field of discipline. It was so difficult for me to communicate at the scientific level. It was difficult to communicate at the cultural level, because it was the first time. So I would advise anyone. So the first thing is try to, I know it's challenging, but I think now things are gradually improving. There are like grants that you can apply for. And then now with the virtual conferences, I think now it's a bit difficult. I don't know how it is with meet and greet with virtual conferences, but with on-site conferences, you have opportunities to do like meet and greet. So if you can look at the outline for some target researchers you would like to interact with. You read about their background, about what they are working on. And if you have like questions in terms of their research, that could be like an opening, in terms of communication. And then from then you can, ask for their contact, and then you can continue to correspond with them. I guess basically that was how it worked for me. So one of the researchers in the workshop I attended, I enjoyed his talk, and I spoke with him, and then afterwards we continued to correspond. And then I applied for the ISN CAEN grant, and with that I was able to move to France. So it wasn't a lot, but it also comes at a sacrifice. I'm sorry, unfortunately, I had to leave my home country, leave my family, but then that's how you try to create your network. And it might not happen immediately, so you have to be consistent. So for some it may happen like at a click, but for others, you just need to be consistent and keep your mind open. If you have like a specific research question you want to pursue, you have not just one person. So maybe you can have like 3 PIs that you want to interact with, and then hopefully one of them is willing to continue collaborating with you.
Great, thank you so much, Ibukan. Abdelrahman, do you mind if I ask the next question to you?
No.
We only have, I could talk to you 3 for hours, and I'm sad that this is only an hour long panel. But we do need to start wrapping it up. And so Tolu's question is actually part of a bigger question that I wanted to ask about how do we improve issues? And so to those who are writing in the Q&A, we'll take down your questions and we'll get you a response from the panelists later on. So apologies that we couldn't get to these questions, but kind of bigger questions in the next 5 to 10 years. What do you think needs to change in order for African neuroscience to flourish? As Tolu mentions in their question, there's a lot of brain drain happening. Ibukun mentioning that you had to go to France and then Portugal. So how do we get address these challenges so we can move forward and make sure that African neuroscience is a thriving culture?
Whilst there can be like tens of policies and minute changes that can be said, I think there are two principles that we need to focus on. First, the big changes need mainly to come from above. While researchers can do a lot of things to improve the research culture and the potential of African neuroscience, big changes can only come from above. And so there is a lot of advocacy work that's needed here. And scientists should be involved in that, because a lot of scientists, they produce high quality, impressive research, but they do not advocate and they are not working and communicating their science and their findings and their importance to the public. So there's a lot of advocacy to get to the political side of it. And I always used to say there's a the shortcut to that is for scientists to hold political positions. But the thing is, not all scientists are good in playing the politics games and reaching out to these levels. So the thing is, you need to reach out to policymakers and stakeholders and advocate these topics to them and tell them that that's how investment in neuroscience research can benefit the country and can benefit its economy and its different fields. It's not only like some theoretical fancy research going in labs. No, this is how it can be reflected back positively on the country. The second thing is for researchers themselves, there needs to be, like this, like Black Neuro and Trend in Africa, like organizations and institutions that advocate for the contents research on an international level. And, they can support that. And, like Trend in Africa are doing tremendous works and like supporting African researchers, making workshops, even importing, research devices whenever they could. So we need more institutions like that can work as on the grassroots to improve the infrastructure for African neuroscience. To me, these are the two most important principles, and you can expand on that.
Yeah, Mahmoud, do you want to just briefly expand on that kind of feature?
Yes, I'm happy to do that. And as you can notice, electricity, I lost electricity, so that's why I went black, But anyway, so I think practically for things to change, there are a number of things. Abdurrahman brilliantly mentioned that we need public engagement. We need scientists going into politics. But also, we need scientists communicating with the public. If you see what I mean, in US, UK, etc., we have charities. Even in Africa, people will be happy to give money if they think that it is for a good purpose. Scientists don't engage with the public to form those charities that can support research. We need to think about how to support neuroscientists to do their research within the continent without having to live for a long time, because that leads to brain drain. Look at me, Ibukun and Abdurrahman, we are all not in the continent. That's not good. How do you do that? You do that by saying, okay, I'm going to fund you to go and do 6 months placement outside, but then I also have funding for you to establish your laboratory back at home. Can you hear me, or did you lose me?
You cut off a little bit, but keep on going. We can still hear you.
Okay, so for collaborators and other institutions, we need you to give scientific equipment to researchers in Africa. This is one of the things that I'm doing right now. I'm setting up a laboratory in Yobe State, and I got donations from the US, from the UK, from Europe, including a confocal microscope. We need a lot of that going to Africa, because then that will give them the infrastructure that they are liking. And thirdly, this is for funders. If you are funding activities, IPRO has been doing that, which is great. fund activities to happen within Africa, not outside Africa, because then within Africa, people will see the challenges of doing research and overcome them rather than going outside. Once they come back from outside, they realize that they cannot continue doing those type of work because the environments are completely different. And finally, it is important for collaborators to give leading role for African researchers, put it in the budget to support them for going for conferences, support them for good housing within even Africa. Because look at me now, no electricity, no internet. I need funding to be able to do this. How can you do research without that, you know? And also provide funding for long-term. Wellcome Trust has introduced a new funding mechanism.
You you did cut off a little bit at the end, but we got it. It's thank you so much for talking about the challenges and for also being here despite the challenges. And Ibukan, we're going to give the last word to you to wrap it up.
I think Mahmoud and Abdurrahman have said it all. Like all the points they raised were spot on. We need changes in terms of policy. The policymakers need to, effect these changes, and there has to be, things need to evolve. We cannot use the same principles we've had for years and has not been working, and we still use these same principles. Things need to change. We need funding for local researchers. If I had the opportunities that Mahmoud just mentioned about, getting funded for research in Nigeria, it was never on my mind to, be out of the country for this long, moving with my family. My kids have to change school like every 5 years. It tells on the family, especially as a woman. It's in research, it's quite, it comes with a lot of struggle. So yeah, we need policy changes, we need funding, we need good infrastructure, and things like electricity, things like internet, this falls in the lap of the government. So there needs to really be a big change.
Yeah, and that change, as you mentioned, can come from multiple different systems, from local governments, all the way to, for you at home or your labs, being good collaborators, as Mahmoud mentioned, what that looks like. Philanthropists, where you're funding your money and making sure that there's agency and autonomy to those African researchers, and that it's not tied to solely your agendas. There's so many things that we can be doing at different system levels. So I encourage folks who are tuning in to reflect on, how you can play a role in making sure that we are removing some of those barriers and not contributing to them. So thank you on that note. Thank you so much, Ibukun, Mahmoud, Abdulrahman. Like I said, I could talk to you for ages. So thank you so much for being here. It was an exceptionally insightful discussion. Thank you again to our conference sponsors, to all of you tuning in. A major thanks to our live captioner and sign language interpreter. Thank you so much. As a reminder, this and all of our events will be available on our YouTube page. If you haven't yet joined the conversation on social media, please do so by putting the hashtag Black in Neuro Research Day for today. And we're at Black in Neuro across all platforms, to Twitter, to Instagram, to YouTube, you name it. And you can follow all of the events for this week at our website. There's a conference booklet that you can go look at other amazing discussions such as this one today. So we hope to see you all there, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.